Hey, welcome. I'm Yoav Weiss. I work on Chrome, co-chairing the Web Platform Incubation Community Group at the W3C, and a Blink API owner, among other roles.
And I'm Chris Wilson. I'm also a co-chair of the Web Incubation Community Group, and I'm a web developer advocate at Google. We're here to discuss how the web platform continues to grow, but more particularly, to explain how Chromium manages new features added to the web platform, and how Google contributes to open standards and works together with the community. Now, before we get going, we wanted to define a few terms, because although you may have heard these all the time, there are some subtle distinctions, and they kind of get lost. Now, Chrome, I would hope everyone knows, is Google's browser. This wraps in a bunch of Google services and user experience features, but Chrome is built on top of Chromium, which is an open source project. And that core open source project also gets used by a number of other browsers: Edge, Samsung Internet Browser, many others. Blink is the web platform engine inside that. Sometimes we'll say Blink when really we mean Chromium and vice versa. Sorry, we've tried to script this really well, but I'm not positive we'll do it right. And Blink is built around the implementation of a number of features. Open standards-based web platform core features that we've all known to come and love, and HTML, CSS, JavaScript, a bunch of other APIs. Most of those are defined in open collaborative forums, like the W3C, the IETF, the WhatWG. The last bit is one that Yoav and I already mentioned, which is the Web Platform Incubation Community Group. We usually call this the YCG. We co-chair this along with Marcos Caceres from Mozilla and Travis Lythod from Microsoft. And this is the place where we start the journey of a lot of these collaborative efforts. Now, we should be clear that open source is not the same as open standards. That's the core of what we want to discuss today, really, how these processes of managing an open source project like Chromium interacts together with the processes of managing an open standards platform like the web.
Yeah, we're here at 10 a.m. to talk about processes, and I want to apologize about that because no one really likes bureaucracy. Everyone have horror stories of processes that went horribly wrong or make no sense, and bureaucrat is rarely a compliment. But at the same time, bureaucracy can be important. Coordinating humans is hard. Chromium is a huge open source project that's seeing 90,000 commits a year from over 2,000 different contributors working for 55 different companies, potentially with multiple organizations inside of each company. And each one of those parties have slightly different interests. It's also important to recognize that a lot of those contributions are coming from Google employees, but non-Google contributors are almost 20% of that pie chart. And as someone who was a Chromium contributor many years before becoming a Google employee, that's something that's near and dear to my heart. So in order to make sure that all those contributions from different parties all make sense, we need an open process. We needed to make sure that the project is making progress towards its goals and remains true to its mission.
And it's important to note that open standards organizations also have their own processes. Now, I'm going to focus mostly on the W3C during the course of this talk. I'm on their advisory board, so I have the most insight there. But the diversity across other open standards organizations is actually fairly similar. The W3C has over 400 different member companies, participating in more than 40 active working groups and interest groups, and 300 community groups that kind of explore different topics in a less organized way. The main document that governs the W3C's process is more than 50 pages long. So there are lots of different people, lots of different needs involved, and in this context, Chromium's engagement is really just one piece that needs to fit into that standards process. In fact, although Google may dominate the participation in Chromium, we're not at all the majority in standards. Yoav just showed you this pie chart of participants in Chromium on the left. The graph on the right is the number of individual participants in the W3C by company. Now, although Google is still that largest slice, single company, we do believe in and we participate really heavily in open standards efforts, we're only about 1/8 of the overall participation. In fact, if you add up all of the Chromium browsers together, like Microsoft's participation and Samsung's participation in Chrome, you'll find this is still less than 1/4 of the whole participation at the W3C. The web is much broader than just Chromium. Now, Chrome is, however, fully committed to the broader web. In fact, the first half of our mission is explicitly to make the web the premier platform for its experiencing the world's information. The second half of our mission is to deliver the best implementation of that platform. Now, it's natural to ask, why do we really care so much about the web? Like, we do work on at least one other premier native platform, and of course, our revenue doesn't come directly from the web itself, like we don't sell Chrome. But the answer is one we've talked about many, many times, starting with the very first Chrome Dev Summit. Those of you who participated in that might recognize this slide and the SLICE acronym. We believe a secure, linkable, indexable, composable, ephemeral platform is critical. Above all, the fact that this platform is open makes it more powerful than any single vendor. Yes, even Google. So these attributes make a shared, openly defined platform, this critical value for users and developers. And although these core critical attributes don't really change over time, like we're pretty much using the same slide from 7 years ago, well, 6 years ago, we want the web to always be open, secure, and ephemeral. It's important to recognize that the web needs to evolve as computing evolves. A viable platform cannot afford to stand still. Computing and how we users experience it continues to march forward, and so does our expectations of computing. When I first started working on the web platform 26 years ago, it was a radically different world, when graphical UIs were still a relatively new concept. The smartphone that's in my pocket right now, the platform for most of my web consumption, that's more powerful than the Cray supercomputers that I worked with at that time. Now, even in more recent times, it took years for the web to pivot, even as a content platform, from desktop to mobile. The web was slow to move from this kind of hard-coded, pixel-perfect desktop experience to a mobile-first development model.
And if we want the web to remain relevant for years to come, there's a lot of work to be done. OK, so we need the platform to evolve, but what's the rush? Admittedly, we are shipping a lot of new features. Can we just slow down? Well, there are multiple areas where we think the web needs to urgently improve. Developer experience is one, because we see developers working around the web platform's basic model of page navigations to create different models that fit them and their users better. We see them, well, using complex tools in order to solve common problems. And we feel like we need to do better. We need to provide better building blocks that will enable developers to easily create the experiences they need. And the 3 talks coming right after this one will outline exactly what we're doing on that front. We also see users spending more and more of their time in native apps and less of their time on the web. We need the web to match those users' expectations of mobile experiences. Highly related to that, there's the performance front, where we have data that shows that most users still have subpar experiences on the web, which we know is causing them frustration at best. And we need a faster web if we want our users to stick around. There are also new user interaction models that are arriving, most notably VR and AR, that the web needs to be ready for. And finally, computing has moved to mobile. The web needs to be as present there as it is on desktop, because this is where the users are. So as the project is focused on improving the web platform, we have 2 major ways, 2 major tools to do that. Adding new features that will help developers and users, and removing user-hostile features from the platform. Both of these have obvious benefits, but also slightly less obvious risks. Removing features can harm web compatibility and break some content that relies on those harmful features. But we feel strongly that the platform cannot live forever with the burden of past mistakes. And given our market share, we feel like it's our responsibility to take on that compatibility risk and enable other browsers to follow. And adding new features, especially when we are the first to ship them, carries another risk, interoperability risk. Different stakeholders in the platform have different views on the urgency of improving it and different levels of investment in it, and therefore can focus on different things that matter to them. Maybe some use case that we think is critical is something that they are not willing to invest resources in or think that the user and developer benefits don't outweigh the extra complexity and cost. And if other browsers never adopt the features we ship, they will never be interoperable, and developers won't be able to use them across the web as part of the platform, which is not our goal. At the same time, if every browser waited for others to ship first, that would result in deadlock and stagnation. And sometimes, in order to convince other vendors that a use case is indeed important, we need data that can only be gathered by real-life usage. Therefore, we unfortunately often find ourselves in a position where we are the first browser engine to ship new features. In order to reduce the risk there, we make sure there's a clear path for other vendors to follow by investing heavily in testing infrastructure, requiring comprehensive test suites, as well as detailed specifications for the features we ship, so that even if we can get those features to be interoperable out the gate, we get to eventual interoperability. And in order to properly manage that risk versus benefit calculus, we have the Blink process.
So if you've interacted at all with the Chromium open source project, you've probably seen people talking about intents. Intents to implement, intents to ship. These intents are part of the Blink process, where a set of trusted Chromium engineers called the API owners, such as Yoav, make sure that the trade-off is being taken into account by the engineers working on different features. Mozilla has a very similar process. This part of our process grew from the WebKit process as well. But as part of these processes, engineers need to show that there's industry agreement or backing, that the feature they're trying to ship is an important one, and also that the feature's design was properly reviewed. That Blink process is not a replacement for the standards process, but a separate one. And it's not determining what gets standardized, but what code can land in Chromium turned on by default. Now, those standards processes, on the other hand, are a lot broader, and they can be a lot slower, too. As I pointed out before, Chromium is just one engine and one slice of the participation driving standards. Now, we do try very hard to build that collaboration between different teams from different organizations and across the wider web standards community by consistently participating in those open forums, the W3C, the WhatWG, the IETF, TC39, and ECMA, and the like, and bringing our needs to those groups to incubate them in public. And this process of incubation first is one that we actually started championing in Chromium a few years ago as a way to explore new additions to the web platform with low overhead, without committing first, without saying, hey, we're going to ship this feature at some point in the very near future, because some ideas fail. In fact, some ideas should fail, but you don't really know that up front. We didn't want to get those ideas baked into a standard before we realized, hey, maybe this wasn't such a great idea. Incubation in the YCG, for example, is a great way to work together in public and collect intellectual property commitments so eventual standards will be free to implement, but with low overhead. In short, the idea was to get to 80% of the exploration with a much lower overhead, but responsibly as well. Now, this leads to a couple of key points. First, incubations can actively fail. They can go into a deep freeze, they can wait for more data, some other change, or in some cases, they may ship in one browser or another prior to transitioning to an official recognized standard. Now, in that latter case, this is not the end of the story. This isn't the end point. Not everyone agrees on which incubations are ready to ship. Everybody has different priorities. But when Chromium ships incubation status specifications, because we believe they're needed, but we don't have agreement from other vendors or developers to turn them into standards yet, we're taking on a deeper responsibility. We have to continue to maintain that feature. We have to continue to push for cross-vendor collaboration and standardization. And if those features do get picked up by others later, we need to work together to possibly change what we already shipped to make them truly cross-industry standards. Incubations are not standards, yet at least. Incubations only turn into standards when a sufficiently cross-industry set of participants in open standards agree that they should become interoperable. Until multiple vendors want to ship those implementations, there's only so much one vendor can really do. Now, we do control our ship cycles. We choose what features Chromium is going to ship and what features Chromium believes are critical to provide to developers. But what becomes a standard is an open community decision. The broader community of developers and vendors need to want this feature to happen. So as incubations mature, and there's open agreement that there should be an interoperable standard, it's time to create a working group with multiple cross-industry stakeholders or be adopted by a working group, and set timelines for deliverables. Formalize the use cases, finalize the design, make sure you have wide review of that design. If you haven't already completed addressing accessibility and privacy and internationalization and other wide review issues, now is the time to finish all of that. You need to finalize a test suite, make sure that we're fully making sure that this is going to be interoperable. And then, of course, finalize the standard, actually get it out in public. Now, this is a super long process. This can be different across different organizations, like the W3C versus the WhatWG, and I don't want to spend all our time in that detail. But with this in mind as the end goal, we wanted to dive into the journey of a feature in Chromium from idea to shipping. And that really is where we start. The first question is, well, what do we work on? And I know it's really tempting to think that Google has some super detailed internal feature plan of exactly what the priorities of all features for the next 5 or 10 years is for the web, sorted in priority order, exact ship dates, everything. Of course, we do try to plan. That is not really the way that it works. In reality, we listen to a lot of inputs. We have to know what areas need attention. And we work very closely together with individual web developer partners out there to get insight into how their work is progressing, ask them where the rough edges of the web are. We also recommend that web developers use a tool initiated by our colleagues at Microsoft, the Web We Want initiative, which is a great place to share ideas that you may have as developers. So browser and platform engine people, we participate in triaging these suggestions. We look at them, we see what people think is important to add to the web platform, and try to take it from there. And both of us, as well as our co-chairs and many others in the web platform standard space, we participate in discussions in the YCG discourse tool, which you can find from our site at ycg.io. This is where a lot of new incubations pop up. And then finally, we participate in a number of other channels. We listen to the results of the MDN survey. We pay a lot of attention to the framework ecosystem. Shubi and Hussein will detail that later this morning. And of course, a lot of other channels and conversations. Now, once we've identified a problem space that we want to address, we, engineers on the Chromium project, start a process of exploring that feature space. And step one in that process is to spend time researching the problem. Now, we're not always perfect at separating this stage out, but we try very hard to focus first on the problem, not a proposed solution, but researching the use cases, figuring out the problem space and the developer needs first, rather than inventing a solution first. The goal of this stage is to publicly publish an explainer with those use cases detailed. There might be a suggested solution, but it's critically important for us not to focus on that first, not to fall in love with our first good idea. To put it another way, if the explainer contains a design for a really great hammer, every use case is going to look like a nail. You might need an electric screwdriver instead, and you won't know that unless you research what kind of fasteners are the use cases. So an explainer is a short, hopefully no more than a page or two, explanation of the problem space. At this point, it grows later. This is the point where the explainer should go to a public forum, So frequently in Chromium, these get published to the YCG discourse to attract attention. This results in a file like this, by the way. This is one of the very first really well-known explainers, the service worker explainer. And we strongly encourage developers to participate at this stage, both by sharing what you need to spark these ideas and these use cases, filing needs in the Web We Want tool or whatever, but also participating in the early discussion of those features. Like, watch the ideas that get shared in the YCG discourse, comment on them, give us your feedback on them. We're building this platform for you, not for ourselves. And in terms of maturity, though, it's really important to understand at this stage, this is not a done, baked feature. This is like a newborn kitten. It's hard to tell exactly what it's going to look like as it matures, and it needs a lot of care and attention.
The next step, once we have a clear understanding of what we're trying to solve and why, is to figure out what a solution may look like, try it out, see how it can be improved, and basically rinse and repeat that process until we're fairly confident we got it right. At this point, the Chromium engineers working on this problem would want to notify others on the projects that they plan to start landing code related to the problem behind a flag turned off by default. This is what the intent to prototype email is for. Intent emails in general are sent over to the Blink dev mailing list and serve as a notification to the broader community of work that's happening in certain areas. That step was previously called intent to implement, but that resulted in some confusion because it wasn't really clear that this only means landing code behind a flag and not some stronger commitment. As a result, Mozilla renamed their similar step in their process to intent to prototype, and we very recently, just last week, aligned with them. Gotta love conference-driven development, huh, Chris? And the purpose of this step is to make sure code owners won't be surprised when they see code starting to land in this area, but starting to work on a certain prototype doesn't require project-wide approvals. This is also a good checkpoint to make sure that the feature is on the right track for getting a wide review and a tag review for the explainer and the initial design, and making sure that we get feedback and opinions from other browser vendors. And if that hasn't happened yet, that checkpoint gives us a lot of time to still do that and correct that course. How can developers get involved? Browser engineers at this stage are craving for feedback. The last steps deliverable was an explainer outlining the use cases. One form of feedback could be to point out related use cases that are not addressed, or otherwise, in case there is a proposed design, pointing out ways in which the design can be improved. And alternatively, a statement of support and real-life examples related to the use cases can be extremely helpful. And if this is a subject you're familiar with and want to get more involved, you can just hop over to the GitHub repo and participate in that early design work. And by the time an intent to prototype is sent, there's probably some rough design in mind, but it's still not too late to change course. At that point, feedback on the API shape, its ergonomics, or its ability to solve your problem is very much welcome. And at that stage, some code might be landing, and the API opens its eyes and starts wobbling around. But it's still extremely early, so no telling how it will end up. And also, I'm now legally obliged to say that these are my kittens, and the credit for the photos goes to my kids, this is all they do.
So the next major step in a feature's journey is to evolve that design by experimenting in code, working together with the community, just plain iterating on development. And at this point, engineers are going to be landing code in Chromium under flags and asking developers to try out those designs, even though the features are switched off by default for users. This is also the stage where open collaboration with others in the standards space becomes even more important to make this a multi-stakeholder project. So how do developers get involved at this point? Well, this stage is really about developer involvement. This is where we're asking developers to try out the designs, to check out a feature, switching on flags and testing them out, with the understanding, of course, that They may not ship. They certainly may not ship in that particular form at all. But we also have another tool that comes into play at this point that we wanted to mention. And in Chrome, we have this tool called origin trials. Now, this is not a mandatory step for feature development. It's a useful one a lot of time because it's a way to get even broader developer testing on a particular feature. A Chromium engineer communicates this intent to experiment, and then any developer out there can register for a key for their domain, and that will turn on the feature for their users, even if the users don't enable the flag or have no idea what this flag is about. This origin trial gets some specific features to prevent it from getting too popular or burning it into the web platform accidentally. This is a way to broadly test features with a wide variety of users, not just those like most of us here who might be convinced to turn on some magic flags. But at this point, the feature is kind of like a teenager. And as a parent of a teenager myself, and as a former teenager, it's maturing. It's pretty stable. It's self-supporting for the most part. And you can see a lot of the shape that it's starting to take as it becomes a real grown-up.
And finally, we're confident enough that an API is in a good shape and would solve real developer and user problems. That's when it's time to try and ship it. That's the point in the process that's a bit more strict. Chromium developers that want to ship a feature by default need to prove that it's mature enough to do that without excessive risk. We talked earlier about the risk and benefit assessment that API owners need to do in order to ship features. This is the point where that assessment happens. And shipping new features requires 3 API owners to sign off on it, or LGTM it, which stands for looks good to me. It's important to note that the fact that an intent email was sent to Blink Dev doesn't, so it means that the team behind the feature thinks that it's ready, but it doesn't yet mean that it will ship soon. There are many cases where the feature team is slightly optimistic, and the API owners conclude that there's more work to be done before the feature can ship. That's fine and a natural part of the process. There are also cases, which are a bit more rare, of features that don't ship at all due to fundamental disagreements, which mean that the risk inherent in the feature outweighs the benefits outweighs its benefits. And while the exciting parts of the process revolve around shipping new things, removing old and busted parts of the platform is equally important for security, performance, as well as interoperability. If we refuse to remove features, that means that adding any new feature would make it part of the platform forever. And willingness to take some compat risk and remove features helps us to ship faster and can also help other browser vendors who can then follow in our footsteps with reduced compatibility risk for their users. Feature removal is equally part of the process, subject to an intent to remove that requires approval from 3 API owners, just like shipping a new feature. That approval typically requires a high bar, or rather, low usage of the feature in order to make sure that the removal won't break the web and won't cause too much compatibility pain. And because we're all humans, we also need to account for cases where we got it wrong. Again, one of the principles that enable us to take that interoperability risk of shipping first is our willingness to change course and remove features if we realize we need to modify them or even unship them entirely. There are cases where after we shipped, substantial feedback from other vendors and developers convince us that we need to change the API shape. And our willingness to make those breaking changes enables us to listen and act on that feedback. Prominent examples include Web Components v0, which shipped and is now in the process of being removed in favor of Web Components v1, and as well as video.
WebVR, which we didn't actually entirely ship, but had to take feedback on. Audio autoplay, where we radically changed the way that we detected autoplay scenarios.
Yeah. And so even when an API is about to ship, there's still a lot of room for developer involvement and feedback. Feedback on the intent thread can provide a lot of insights and can influence the API owner's decision. Similarly to the previous step, playing around with the implemented API by turning on flags before it's shipped and reporting issue, or even after it's shipped, can be extremely helpful for newly shipped APIs. And finally, actually using the APIs you find useful is an extremely strong signal for us to ensure us that we made the right decision. And at this point, the feature is fully mature on its own, theoretically in the wild, but in practice just sits on the couch all day. This is where the metaphor kind of breaks down. So to recap, the typical journey of an API goes from researching the problem space, publishing an explainer with use cases, designing a solution in the open with interested parties, experimenting with that solution, and eventually shipping it or not. And note that at any stage, we can decide that we need to go back and address some issues. For example, an origin trial can reveal that there are some problems in the design or the understanding of the problem space and cause us to go back to 1 or 2 steps before that. And on top of that, there are always exceptions to that general flow. So just last week, we had an intent to experiment for an origin trial that was required in order to gather data to understand a certain use case and know whether it will or will not provide performance benefits. So an origin trial is part of step 0, if you will.
So what we would like you to take away from this talk is, first, there is a difference between Chromium process and standards process. They work together, but they're not replacements for each other. Our intent process is intended to make it possible for us to move the web platform forward, even if we have to go out on a limb sometimes, but also work together with the standards process. This is all done in public on purpose, and we'd really love to get developer involvement at every stage of this. Adopt an API space, propose needs in Web We Want, look at proposals on the YCG discourse, file issues in individual feature incubations, watch the intents on Blink Dev. Give us feedback on all those things you care about, because that's what we're really looking for. And with that, we'd like to close. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.